which is why you want your research to be uncorrupted by self-interested motivation, which is the purpose of which is precisely, rather, the normative principle of disinterestedness, which is getting ignored in all this. Alrighty, I'm back. This one came across my plate. It was not something I necessarily wanted to get into, but this one, when I saw it, needed to be talked about. Because I think it reflects a little something interesting, because this thing here, you can see the headline from Science. NSF grant decisions reflect systemic racism, study argues. Funding success rates for white scientists far exceed the NSF average, whereas Black and Asian researchers do worse. Oh boy. Can you pick out the fallacy in that pair of statements already? Anyway, but this whole thing here is not pointing to a published peer-reviewed article. It is pointing to something called a preprint. Preprints, they're the bane of a lot of things, particularly when it comes to reporting on science and what have you, because what a preprint is it's a published copy of an article that has not yet gone through the peer review process. It has not been vetted. It has not been critiqued carefully by anyone yet. But it's put out there because there's these things called preprint servers where you can stick these articles that have not been peer-reviewed, published yet, and what have you. The problem with this is that they then get picked up by science journalists if it's a catchy headline or something like that, or just journalists in general, news media, what have you, and talked about as if they're gospel. And unfortunately, Science just did that with this. It is a preprint. I did get the preprint. I have it here, and I read it a little bit earlier. I'm not going to go through all of it right now, though I will show you some of the highlights from the preprint itself. And because it's publicly accessible, go on and take a look for yourselves. Encourage you to do that and draw your own conclusions, per usual. But let me read a little bit of the Science article first. White scientists are more likely to win a grant from the National Science Foundation than researchers from other racial and ethnic groups, according to an independent analysis of more than 2 decades of NSF data on its merit review process. The analysis supports earlier studies finding similar racial disparities in the funding of scientists by other federal agencies, notably the National Institutes of Health. Its authors, a team led by geochemist Christine Yifeng Chen, my apologies if I didn't pronounce the name right, a postdoc at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, attribute the gap in NSF funding rates with white scientists at the top and Asian researchers at the bottom to systemic racism. The NSF funding disparities, quote, have cascading impacts that perpetuate a cumulative advantage to white principal investigators across all of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, they write in their study posted earlier this month on the Center for Open Science preprint site. The team gave a copy of its analysis to NSF leadership, which is not challenging its conclusions. NSF Director Sethu Raman Panchanathan, I cannot pronounce that. I need to hear, with things like that, I need to hear it spoken, so I know how to pronounce it. So, I apologize if I butchered the pronunciation. Quote, shares these concerns about systemic racial disparities in funding at NSF and other agencies, an agency spokesperson says. Researchers dived into detailed annual NSF reports that contain data on 1 million proposals submitted to the agency between 1996 and 2019. The reports mention racial disparities only in passing, but Chen and her team focused on them after hearing complaints from senior non-white colleagues about what they felt was an uneven playing field in winning NSF grants. Interesting. So, this is all apparently initiated by early career scientists, which, hey, good on you for initiative, right? You know, I do not knock that in the slightest. But I did notice some things in the preprint itself. Here, and this is actually it. It's a little small to read here. I've got it open in another tab. But as I said, it has not been published anywhere. It has not been peer-reviewed. And that is a key thing because it means it hasn't been vetted in the slightest. It hasn't gone through the serious critiques that most articles go through and should go through, mind you. Part of the reason peer review exists is to make sure cruddy stuff is not being published. But if I go back for a moment to this, just on this bunch of statements, white scientists are more likely to win a grant from the National Science Foundation than researchers from other ethnic and racial groups, according to an independent analysis of more than 2 decades of NSF data on the merit review process. Attribute the gap in NSF funding rates to systemic racism. Do you see the problem with that? If you've been on this channel for a while, you know I've harped on this a few times with a lot of researchers, actually, including papers in Nature, making the same unfortunate fallacy. It's a logical fallacy that Coleman Hughes refers to as the disparity fallacy. In more strict logical reasoning, it is the single cause fallacy. You attribute it to systemic racism. You didn't prove it. You really want me to be bloody honest? I did read through the preprint. You really didn't prove it. And I think any peer reviewer worth their salt is going to come back and say, hopefully come back and say that. So there's only a couple of things I wanted to point out. So they do go in here and show some interesting graphics. I mean, what's lacking in a tremendous amount of ways from these, a lot of standard error bars that I would really like to see, to be honest, with some of these things, particularly some here. Oh, there's something I was searching for before, because one of the things I saw, by applying multivariate regression techniques to data extracted directly from NIH grants management database, researchers controlled for factors that might affect grant success, such as educational background, what have you, and things like that. Okay. They put the methods for this study in the supplemental material. And I can tell you right now, because I have a control F up here, you can't quite see it because it's off the top of the page, but there's only one ever mention of the word regression, and they never go into any detail about how that regression was done, what was the error of the regression itself, or anything like that. Gives me no confidence. Actually, the fact that they did not do any of that gives me absolutely no confidence in the results in here. And I would hope a peer reviewer worth their salt would actually see these kinds of things. And there's a reason I pick apart these studies. It's just like I get intense. Oh, speaking of which, I will tell you right now, as per my usual thing when I do review of any articles, and including when I do any articles, really. Whether it be here or professionally, I never look at a person. There's only 2 times I look at a person's name when I'm looking at an article. So once, just to make sure that I've not written a paper with a person. I don't recognize the name. If I don't recognize the name, odds are I haven't written a paper with that person in the last 5 years, which removes any conflict of interest for me for actually reviewing the paper. Because generally, it's a good rule of thumb. Don't review a paper if you've been that is written by somebody whom you've co-written papers with in the last few years, because you have a bias toward that person, and you also, you know that person. You have bias toward that person. You have a conflict of interest because you've written papers with them before. The only other time I look at a person's name when I'm writing something is just to make sure I got the name spelled right when I'm submitting the review, kind of thing. That's really the only time I ever look at that. And there's a reason for that, because I don't really care to know what your background is. I really don't care. Not the point, not my job to care. And frankly, I wish peer review was double blind. I wish peer review of proposals was double blind. That would probably alleviate an awful crap ton of problems. But they've never done that. They've never decided to do that. That would be where I would start with a lot of things. I would prefer that myself. But c'est la vie, right? With that one. So there was some other things that I noticed. They do point out some serious limitations. Oh, yes. It was in here in the limitations of the data that I found something humorous. Consider this. So they're making all these characterizations in the study. And again, I don't have time today to go through absolutely everything. Maybe when I get back to get a little bit more time back in my regular schedule, which I apologize because I have been insanely busy the last couple of months. And it's been hard for me to get to do my usual paper reviews. Maybe what I'll do is I'll wait for this to get peer reviewed and published somewhere, and then I will take a good look at it for this channel in depth. But I will just at this moment not do that. Okay. So let's see. Yes, I think it's that. Here, as they say, an important consideration of this analysis is that the data reported by NSF pose some issues that limit inquiry of the underlying causes of these racialized funding rate disparities. Since 2003, NSF has used racial and ethnic categories and definitions set by the Office of Management and Budget in 1997, following government-wide standards for federal data collection. However, racial and ethnic categories are understood to be social constructs with no biological basis, and as such are complex and highly mutable over time, subject to changes in social perceptions of race and self-identification. Okay, one thing I'm noticing here is, one thing I'm going to make a point of, Sheena Mason actually does a really great thing called the theory of racelessness. And one of the things that she talks about is that quite often our, what we want to call race is actually more along the lines of ancestry and ethnicity is what's really meant. And particularly with geographic thing, and I will show you this in a minute, that they actually put this out with NSF's categories. That's actually really what it's about, is more so about ancestry and ethnicity than it is about race, to be honest. And of course it makes me wonder, if you were doing this differently and you were focusing on each of the different ethnicities, would you end up with the same disparities, or would you not? And so that's not a question I see them answer, and I would actually prefer to see them do that. But they're going by NSF's categorizations. The other thing is, it's like, the fungible thing here raises questions about whether or not the disparities they even show here are even significant. Let alone the fact that we're still just talking about disparities in all of this. And as much as it is heavily suggested throughout much of this paper, this preprint, at least from what I could find reading it earlier, the authors never, ever definitively show that any of these disparities that they point to are caused by systemic racism. But it is quite well assumed many times over from what I can see in here. Read this over a few times quite quickly, and I mean, I see disparity. Yeah, I see disparity. And here's the thing. The broad consistencies in racial funding disparities in NSF and NSF suggest similar or related mechanisms may be in effect across most, if not all, science funding contexts. Deeper examinations of NIH racial funding disparities over the past decade have uncovered additional insights. By applying multivariate regression techniques to data extracted directly from NIH grants management database, researchers controlled for factors. Oh, so in other words, you didn't do this regression in your own study. You didn't do this regression in your own study. They did this regression there, and you kind of didn't bother with it yourselves. Oh, good grief. I love how we conflate disparities and biases and all this kind of stuff too. This is the unfortunate problem with allowing postmodernist approaches into STEM fields, because postmodernism doesn't care much for the truth. But such is their so yeah, I don't know that I have too much to say on this. I mean, I look at graphics like this, and of course I'm also like, wait a minute, where is, well, this isn't actually really what I was thinking of as much, because that's more of a strange graphic. I mean, there's not strange graphic. It's not strange, maybe the best word, but anyway. For one thing, you didn't plot all of these things together, which actually would have been good. The other thing is, I don't see any error bars for any of this. Here, there's no error bars for any of it. So I can't tell, what are the standard errors of these things. There's no statistical significance testing anywhere that I could find here, which would be relevant and really useful in something like this. But there was none of it that I could find when I was reading through this preprint. And let me see here. Reimagining scientific funding. Yeah. Here. Goodness. Okay. Shifting the present scientific paradigm to be centered on equity will require individual, collective, and institutional commitments to elevating justice, respect, and community as core operating principles in science. Such transformation may also be advanced by an expansion beyond mainstream structures, institutions, methodologies, and ways of knowing to support and conduct scientific research. Only then can science meet the unprecedented challenges of the present and future. There's something I wanted to read on that, because Rogue Journal Club is returning, by the way. We just had to take a brief break. We actually recorded an episode last night, as of this recording. And it's going to be on a similar vein to this particular thing that I just read in this paper, but from this paper, I wanted to read one thing. There are many reasons for this lack of connection between, this comes from a different paper, between science, societal issues, and solving wicked problems. One is because the current culture of science views maintaining the independence of the scientific endeavor as a primary consideration. Short-term political considerations or the current issue du jour should not influence what scientific questions are addressed or how science is performed. Another aspect of our current scientific culture, stemming from the Endless Frontier report, is that science should be left to the professionals. Involving stakeholders in framing scientific questions or investigating scientific issues would inevitably decrease the rigor of these activities. A third is the notion that normative issues like justice, equity, or values should not influence what kind of scientific questions are addressed or how science is performed. In the currently predominant paradigm, science and society need to coexist, but she should be hermetically separated. So that's drawn from a paper that draws its inspiration from Jane Lubchenco's 1997 speech on the new social contract of science, but which has problems in and of itself. But I see it reflected here in the idea that we should have all of these values in here. And I am reminded over and over and over again, and I'm going to take a wager. I might take a wager here that these young scientists, that the young scientists invested here probably didn't ever get any discussion of the normative principles of science, why they exist, why they're good, why we strive for them, knowing that we're not perfect, because humans are never perfect in any endeavor they do. But they probably never taught that in grad school. Probably never taught that in master's program or PhD program or in undergrad. And I'm not going to fault them for that, because I was never taught it either. I had to go do some digging on my own and learn some serious philosophy of science and why these normative principles are what they are and what makes them so good, actually. But the idea that one should put these things in here, but here's the problem I see with this. What do you mean by justice? What do you mean by equity? What do you mean by respect and community? What do you mean by all of these things? Because problem with this is that the minute you start incorporating and pushing pushing these somewhat nebulous things into science, you run a really serious problem of very different interpretations of what those words mean. And that goes back to a postmodernist kind of philosophy, is the language is fungible here and can mean many different things, and social constructivist worldview that everything about our reality is constructed with the power of language and what have you. Cynical theories, read it. And I don't know that's a good thing, because you start getting into encouraging young scientists to bias their own work, to introduce biases in their own work. If the point of what we're doing is to attempt to remove bias, and yet you are pushing in values that will bias people, and will bias research in one direction or another, how then are you actually solving the problem? So it's drives me crazy, these kinds of things, because there is a very good reason to keep some separation between scientific research and what's going on in everything in society. And that is precisely to avoid biasing research in one direction or another, introducing said biases. And yet, it seems now what we want is to forcibly introduce biases, because we have to. There's a lot of weird things that come up when you get into this, but it seems like you want to introduce biases to try and correct biases that resulted from people being the people of their time, which, they would be awful by today's standards. And I'm not gonna knock that they are awful. The standards of past and the way things that were done 50, 60 years ago, 100 years ago or so, yeah, horrific. But introducing bias to correct old bias is what I get out of these kinds of things. And in the normative principle of science that is disinterestedness, you are attempting to push, Merton, 1942, you're attempting to push toward the truth, which is why you want your research to be uncorrupted by self-interested motivation, which is the purpose of which is precisely, rather, the normative principle of disinterestedness, which is getting ignored in all this. Which I am not surprised it's getting ignored, because most early career scientists have probably never been taught anything about it. So this goes down to the supplemental, and there's a lot in here. So like I said, I'm not going to get into this right now, but I will link to the preprint for you. I just wanted to leave you to show you this is the categories that they used here with the different racial categories as NSF defines it, from 1997 Census Bureau kind of thing. So yeah, take that for what you will, here and how they accounted for it. But I am unimpressed, and I will say overall, having read it, I can't point you to where they definitively say, or definitively show, rather, that the disparities they see are caused by systemic racism, because it's not there. It's absolutely not there. You can tell me a disparity is this all the time, all you want, and here it is right here. Systemic racism manifests at the NSF as higher funding rates for proposals by white PIs than those by non-white PIs, conferring cumulative racial advantage. A single cause fallacy right there, and I hope any peer reviewer worth their salt, I hope they will. I hope they'll flag that, because they never demonstrated it anywhere in the study that I could find. I mean, I'll read it again more thoroughly. I'll read it again a bit more. No, I'll read it again, because I read through it pretty much, and it's just like, I don't see it anywhere. Which, you're going to make assumptions, fine. You can make an assumption. I'm going to call it BS, though. That's it for now. Let me know what you think if you want to have a perusal here. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good jazz. As always, this will all be linked in the description of the video for you. Until next time, I'm Adrian, and I hope you stay curious, everybody.